This particular video then is going to look at observations, and there's a number of different observations and types of observations that you need to know about. For example, structured and unstructured, covert, overt, participant, non-participant, and event and time sampling. And these are all different ways of conducting an observation. And we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses of a few of these as well. Firstly, we're going to have a look at what the difference between overt and covert observations are. So covert observations, as you can probably get from the name, like a covert operation, is something that is done undercover. And people are not aware that they're being watched. On the other hand, an overt observation is an open observation. So the people involved in it will be aware that they're taking part in an observation. If we're thinking of maybe looking at aggression on the playground during lunchtime, if we were going to do an observation of that, a covert observation would be maybe hiding away in the art block, looking out of one of the windows and making an observation based on what we see. None of the pupils will be aware that we're watching, so it would be a covert observation. If we want to do it as an overt observation, we could be in the middle of the playground with a clipboard, maybe a white coat to show we're a psychologist doing an observation and making points as we see fit. So we've got overt and covert observations. So the next question is, which is best to use, the overt or covert observations? And covert observations are usually a little bit better because participants are unaware that they're actually involved in observation. And because of that, their behaviour is much more natural. However, there are ethical issues with covert observations. It's absolutely fine and totally acceptable to observe people in public. However, ethical issues start to arise when we're observing private behaviours, maybe kissing their boyfriend or kissing a partner. Okay, so although we get much more natural behaviour with covert observations, we do have the ethical issues of they're not aware they're being observed, and especially when it's private behaviour, that can start to raise ethical issues. So there are a number of different ways to record a psychological observation, and the two main ones are time and event sampling. With time sampling, the observer will write down absolutely everything that they can observe, whereas event sampling, we use tally charts or behaviour criteria or behaviour categories to record our behaviour. So we might tick off the number of times a particular action or a particular behaviour has been observed. So time sampling, we're writing everything down. Event sampling, we're ticking off using tally charts and behaviour categories. So we've also got structured observations. And structured observations are where we use a coding scheme or a coding mechanism in order to record the behaviours that are happening. And structured observations usually provide us with quantitative or numerical data. Because we're using a tick list or checklist or tally chart of some sort, we just count up the number of times that behaviours occurred. So if we were looking at aggression on the playground, I might have punches as one of my behaviour categories, and I might tick off that happened 15 times during lunch. So I get a quantitative, a numerical number at the end of that observation. I can know there's 15 punches, 12 kicks, 4 swear words, whatever my categories are. I'll be provided with numerical data at the end of that observation. So some of you might still not be unsure, or might be unsure about what a behaviour category is. And a behaviour category is basically the psychologist operationalising the behaviour that they're looking for. So, like our example of aggression in the playground, my behaviour categories on my tally chart might be punching, kicking, swearing, and any other aggressive behaviours that I can think of. And it should cover all potential behaviours. If you don't have all of them in your list, you're likely to miss certain behaviours because you're unable to actually record them. So if throwing a bottle at someone was not on my criteria, but some boys were doing it, I wouldn't be able to record that particular bit of information. And that means certain information gets missed when we're using behaviour categories. And also, they should all be mutually exclusive. By that, what I mean is I shouldn't be able to tick it off in two different criteria. So each behaviour that happens should have one clear criteria that I could put in. So here's a little look at two different types of behavioural categories. So we're looking at this first one, an observation checklist of a student when the teacher leaves a room. So as soon as I leave a room, I've got what pupils will usually do. Carries on working. Okay, not going to be very many of you. Uses a mobile phone. Yep, that's going to be the vast majority. There'll be a lot of ticks there. Tick, tick, tick. Talks to another student. Don't know, it depends how many of you are using your mobile phones, I suppose. Listens to music. Some of you will probably leave the room, might go to the toilet, get a drink, or just leave the lesson completely. Reading a magazine. Very few of you will probably do that. Some of you might. Falls asleep. Definitely one or two of you in there that will do that. And eats. So I've got all these different behaviours, and we might tick them off. Someone could be observing, maybe via CCTV or maybe through the window, how many times each of these behaviours occurs. And what happens at the end is we get numerical data for each of these different categories. However, remember, certain behaviours might not be included. We might have a fight breakout between two pupils, but that doesn't get recorded because it's not one of the behaviour categories. If we have a look at the next behaviour category, we've got observations recorded every 15 seconds and placed into behaviour categories. So this is when we put a young child or baby under the age of 3 into a room. Okay, and this is something called a strange situation that you're going to learn about with attachment. And we try and see how the baby reacts when the mother leaves the room, or when the mother enters the room, or when a stranger leaves the room or a stranger enters the room. So we look at how they show these different behaviours. We look at their proximity and contact seeking. Does the child seek out the mother? Do they stay with the mother? We look at, do they avoid the mother? Do they resist her? And do they look and actively search out for their primary caregiver or their mother? And what we do is we just tick off every time we feel that this behaviour happens. Okay, 7 being really intensely, they're definitely doing this. 1 being they're doing it, but not very much. And we record this every 15 seconds. So you can see the key of having behaviour categories is making sure these behaviour categories are all the behaviours that we're going to see during that time. So a structured observation, like we said, is using a coding system. An unstructured observation, on the other hand, records everything they can see. The observer will write down absolutely everything that they see during that time. However, this can be very, very difficult if we don't have recording equipment to use. You need a video camera, something like that, in order to make sure that the observer doesn't miss certain things. They can go back, analyse the video later, and make sure they ticked off all the behaviours and wrote down all the behaviours that they needed to. It also requires an awful lot of training. In order to observe this efficiently, we need to make sure our psychologists are trained. And this can take a lot of money and a lot of time in order to get someone in a good enough position to go and do an observation and be able to write down absolutely all the correct behaviours that they want. And another problem with unstructured observations is that we get a lot of qualitative data. So we get a lot of writing, a lot of descriptive information about how people are acting and what they're doing. And it can be very difficult to analyse that sort of information. Unlike numerical data, that's very easy to analyse. We've also got participant and non-participant observations. So non-participant observations are where the researcher sets up the study and doesn't take part in the observation. They observe it from a distance, so they'll be away from whatever's happening, observing the behaviours taking place. Whereas participant observations, on the other hand, is where the researcher sets up the observation and actually takes part in it as well. So if we were going to do the, let's say, aggression during a rugby match. So if we're doing a non-participant observation, the researcher might set up a game and observe from the stands. Whereas if he was doing a participant observation, he might take part in the actual game itself. He might record the information. He might not be able to write it down, but he might be able to record it over a dictaphone in order that any aggressive behaviour gets recorded. But it's a participant observation because he's in the game itself. And the question is, which one's better to use, a participant or a non-participant observation? Well, non-participant observations are usually far more objective because the researcher isn't actually part of the study itself. However, participant observations, they do give us an insight into what it's like in the middle of the action. So they do both have their strengths. We also have what are known as naturalistic observations. And these are observations that occur in a natural setting. So where everything is left absolutely normal and the researcher does not interfere with anything that's happening. So it might be observing a child in nursery who goes there all the time. It's completely natural, it's completely normal for that child in that particular environment. However, there is no independent variable here, which means we're not able to establish any cause and effect. Okay, we're not allowed to establish a causal relationship between what we're observing and what's actually happening. So what we're doing is watching something in its natural environment. Controlled observations, on the other hand, are where we control certain variables within the study. And what that does is it reduces the naturalness of the environment and therefore the naturalness of the participants' behaviour. People aren't going to act like they normally do if we're controlling the observation. And it's usually done within a lab study. So people are going to act slightly differently than they would normally because it's in an artificial environment. And the result of that is that participants often know they are being observed. One of the examples is, for those of you that have done aggression already, or have looked at anything about aggression, is Bandura's Bobo dolls experiment. And what he looked at was whether children would be aggressive if they watched an adult being aggressive before them. So an adult go into a room, hit a Bobo doll, and then he observed the children to see when they went into the room, would they hit that Bobo doll as well? So we're controlling certain things within this environment. We've got him in a lab study. We are controlling the fact we're sending an adult into a room to hit the Bobo doll. And we're observing the child's reaction to that artificial environment. So that would be a controlled observation where we're controlling particular parts of the study. And this allows us to establish cause and effect. Because we're changing something in the environment, we're able to say that might be the cause of aggression. So in Bandura's experiment, for example, he was able to state that the children learned to be aggressive through observational learning. They observed role models who would be adults acting in a particular way, and that made them become aggressive. So we're going to look at the advantages of a naturalistic observation. And obviously we're observing natural behaviour, like it would happen in the real world. So any behaviour that we do observe is unaffected by anything else that might happen in a lab study, things such as anxiety or the need to impress other people, which means it has high levels of ecological validity. This can be completely applied to the real world because we're observing it in the real world. However, they also have their disadvantages. For example, we can't control as many extraneous variables. If we can't control those extraneous variables, it's very difficult to establish cause and effect. And like I said earlier, in order to train someone to do an observation of this manner, to write down everything they're seeing, it can be exceptionally costly and exceptionally lengthy process. And also, it depends on the coding system that the observer is using. Like most observations, if we're using a coding system, then we're going to struggle to record any interesting behaviour that goes off of that particular criteria. So something might happen that we really want to record, but it's not on our criteria, it's not in our behaviour categories, so we can't document that particular behaviour. So finally, we're going to have a look at the advantages of observations as a method. So this is observations as a whole. We're not looking at specific ones, we're looking at it as a technique for an experiment. So they can give us rich information. We get an awful lot of information and unexpected information from observations. And as a result of observations, we can then start to conduct experiments. Also, they give us a great picture of what's happening in the real world, in a natural environment, which is really, really important to understand. Also, if they're done correctly, if they're done maybe covertly, then the researcher intrudes very little into the environment and into that situation. So it means they can have exceptionally high levels of ecological validity. It also means that we can look at particular things that we can't replicate in a laboratory. So a lot of things like wedding behaviour, behaviours in bars, we can't conduct that in a laboratory. We can't conduct that in an artificial environment. So the only way we can look at those sort of behaviours are by doing observations. But like any method in psychology, we also have disadvantages. So one, it depends on who the sample are. If the sample that we're using in our experiment aren't good for an observation, then the observation is going to be absolutely pointless. Also, it depends on the length of time. So if we were doing an observation of aggression on the playground, we might only be able to do a 20-minute observation. That might be too short. We might miss the other 20 minutes behaviour that happens during that lunchtime. So it's really important that the time is taken into consideration of each observation. They can be very time consuming and labour intensive. So especially if we're writing down all the information, so we're doing a time sampling observation where we're writing down every single little bit of information, then that can be a very time consuming process. We might have to observe it, make notes at the time, film it. We might then have to watch the film back again to make sure we didn't miss any behaviours. So it can be quite a lengthy process if you do an observation correctly. And also you've got the problem of observer bias. So this is where the researcher knows the aims and their hypothesis and what they want to prove. So what they do is in an observation, they pick out those behaviours that is going to help them prove their hypothesis. And the results then get distorted because the researcher is only focusing on those events that they want to see. We also get a lot of ethical issues when it comes to observation. So it is very difficult to get informed consent, especially if you're doing a naturalistic or covert observation. You can't get someone's informed consent. Otherwise, they're going to know they're being observed. They're going to know that they change their behaviour. In laboratories, we possibly can do it that way. We could use one-way mirrors. So we could do an observation in a laboratory. They think it's a wall or something on the wall, whereas we're actually watching through a one-way mirror. And that means that maybe their behaviour might be a little bit more natural. We can get their consent, but we can still observe their behaviours. Obviously, for children, you can get parental consent, which gets around that part of getting informed consent from the children themselves. Also, you've got the issue of the invasion of privacy. So people's confidentiality when doing observations should be respected. Like I said earlier, we shouldn't be observing private behaviours that are going to intrude on a person's privacy. So it's absolutely fine to observe someone in public. People expect to be seen by other people. But when they start moving away, they shouldn't really be followed. There should be the rules of general decency and privacy should still be respected. The final thing we're going to have a look at then is how to improve the reliability of an observation. So one of the ways we can do this is using something called inter-observer reliability. So this is where I'll get two researchers to do the observation. They'll use the exact same behaviour categories, the same checklist, and they'll observe the same thing happening. And what we do then is we compare their scores at the end and we correlate their scores. And if there's a correlation between the two observers, so if they've got similar scores, then we're able to say the results of the observation are reliable. So although there's not too many things we can do, inter-observer reliability is definitely one of them. And also filming the observation, allowing us to then analyse it at a later date. We can give it to psychological experts to help them analyse it to check that we're correct as well. So there are certain things we can do in order to improve the reliability of our observations.